My lady, can you see and hear me?
I can now, both.
Great. My lady, the next witnesses to be called are Mr. Mark Norris, Ms. Nicola Dickey, Dr. Chris Llewellyn and Ms. Alison Allen.
Ms Dickey, just before they're sworn or affirmed, sorry about your problems this morning with transport.
Thank you.
My lady, these witnesses are representatives from the local government associations of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, respectively. Could they be sworn, please?
Ms Dickey, I'll start with you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
If you would be kind to repeat the words after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
will be the truth
will be the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Go through the same process. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Norris, thank you very much for attending to give evidence today. Could you give your full name, please?
Mark Norris.
And there should be a statement in front of you dated 5th February 2026, INQ 000660146. Can you confirm that is a statement that you have provided for the purposes of this inquiry?
I can.
And within that statement, you adopt the contents of another statement of Ms. Joanna Killian dated 27th October 2025. Is that correct?
It is.
And can you confirm that any facts stated within the statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can.
Thank you. Ms. Dickey, thank you very much indeed for returning to give evidence again today. Could you give your full name, please?
Nicola Dickey.
And there should also be a statement in front of you dated 23rd October 2025, INQ 000588234. Can you confirm that's a statement that you've provided for the purposes of the inquiry?
I can.
And can you confirm that any facts stated within the statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I do.
Dr. Llewellyn, thank you very much for returning to give evidence again today. Could you give your full name, please?
Chris Llewellyn.
There should be a statement in front of you dated 15th September 2025, INQ 000659923. Can you confirm that is a statement that you've provided for the purposes of the inquiry?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you confirm that any facts stated within the statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yeah, that's correct.
And finally, Ms. Allen, thank you very much for returning to give evidence again today. Could you give your full name, please?
Alison Allen.
And there should be a statement in front of you dated 21st September 2025, INQ 000659923. Can you confirm that's a statement that you have provided for the purposes of the inquiry?
Yes, I can.
And can you confirm that any facts stated within the report are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much. Turning first to the preliminaries, as either you yourselves or colleagues have given evidence before, I will touch only briefly on your extensive professional experience and the memberships of your associations. But first, Mr. Norris, you are Principal Policy Advisor at the Local Government Association, which I will refer to as the LGA. Is that correct?
It is.
And you've been in that role since 2015, but I understand you've worked for the LGA for 18 years?
I have, yes.
And is it correct that the LGA's membership includes nearly all of the councils in England, and also, due to the Welsh Local Government Association's corporate memberships, all the principal Welsh councils?
It is, yes.
Now, at paragraph 16 of your statement, you explain how the LGA had a wide-ranging role during the pandemic, including capturing the views and concerns of the councils on the ground who were leading the local response. Is that a fair summary?
It is, yes.
Thank you. And also, you've explained how the LGA fed back those views and concerns to inform central government decision-making, which has been the focus of previous modules. Is that right?
It is, yeah.
Thank you. Moving then to you, Ms Dickey, you are the Director of People Policy for the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, which I shall refer to as COSLA. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes,
And
correct.
you explain COSLA's role throughout the pandemic at paragraphs 2.5 and 2.6 of your statement. In summary, is it correct that COSLA continued to function as the membership organisation of all 32 local authorities in Scotland?
Correct.
And in particular, COSLA championed council's work to secure the resources and powers they needed to respond to the pandemic?
Yes, we did.
And you engaged with government and others on policy, funding and legislation. Is that fair?
Correct.
Turning to you, Dr Llewellyn, you are the Chief Executive of the Welsh Local Government Association, which I shall refer to as the WLGA. Is that right?
Yeah.
And all the local authorities in Wales are members of WLGA. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And as we've heard, WLGA is a corporate member of the LGA. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, Dr Llewellyn, you say at paragraph 13 of your statement that during the pandemic, WLGA facilitated urgent and regular consultation and engagement between the Welsh Government and others with the councils. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And that's across many aspects of the collective COVID-19 response?
Yeah, that's correct.
And we've also heard your evidence about that engagement in previous modules. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Finally, Ms Allen, you are the Chief Executive of the Northern Ireland Local Government Association, which I shall call NILGA, and you note at paragraph 13 of your statement that the councils you represent don't have the same responsibilities as those in England, Scotland and Wales. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
However, what you've done for us is set out NILGA's understanding of the impact of the pandemic on communities where you can assist.
Yes, absolutely.
You have been able to assist in relation to most of the areas that we are covering during the course of this afternoon. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Paragraph 15 of your statement, is it fair to say that the objective of NILGA was to inform and be informed on all pandemic matters as they related to the role of local government in supporting communities?
That's correct.
Thank you very much indeed to all of you for that introduction and for your statements, which are extensive. I'm going to focus my questions on the impact of the pandemic as understood by local authorities under 5 broad headings, and I will list those now. First, community-level sports, leisure and cultural institutions. Second, vulnerable groups. Third, homelessness. Fourth, key workers. And fifth, bereavement services and funerals. So I will start first with sport and leisure, the first topic. If I can turn to you first, Mr. Norris, leisure facilities specifically are covered in your statement in some detail at paragraphs 72 to 83, but I'll take you through what appear to be the main points. And you note that the closure of leisure facilities in the first instance meant there was an immediate loss of an important income stream. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
But what you also say is that notwithstanding their closure, they'd still have very expensive running costs.
They did. So I think in the statement you see that we make a reference there to swimming pool filters, for example. So the replacement of those would be £20,000 per filter. Some other work that we did at the same time, I think, estimated that the average utility bills for some of the leisure centres just for a month would be around £40,000. And certainly work by Community Leisure UK at the same time estimated that something in the region of £473,000 would be the monthly costs of keeping a leisure centre going, even when you've got furloughed staff, because you're taking into account pensions, loans, and other costs that you would need to pay for. So yes, there would be a lot of ongoing expenditure that would be needed.
So that's the financial impact. We've heard in the inquiry already a lot of evidence about the positive benefits of physical activity in boosting physical and mental health. Is it right that LGA were also very concerned about the closure of public leisure facilities for that reason?
We were. It's an important part of ensuring people's fitness and activity, that they can access those facilities at any time.
And you've referred in your statement at paragraph 77 to some work that LGA did with groups such as UK Active and Sport England in order to support councils to continue to provide facilities. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
My lady, I don't need to take the witness to this, but you may recall that insights from UK Active and Sport England are contained within the community level Sport and Leisure Roundtable report. And just so you know, the witness have had sight of a number of those reports, including that one, and also the separate statements from all of the sports and arts councils of the 4 nations of the UK. I'll refer to a few extracts from those as we continue. But back to you, Mr. Norris. One point you make at paragraph 79 is that many leisure providers delivering these sorts of services for councils fell between the cracks in terms of initial support packages. Is that correct?
It is. There was, I think it's fair to say that an understanding of the particular circumstances of how in England the leisure services are structured, particularly those provided by local authorities, was not appreciated by central government, and as a result, while there was a range of schemes in place to support other parts of local government, but also in terms of the wider economy, we ended up in a position where leisure centres, as you described it, fell through the gaps because they weren't properly taken account of, and the particular needs that they needed to be acknowledged weren't factored into government's considerations.
And following lobby from the LGA and others, it's right to say that the National Leisure Recovery Fund was introduced. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
And you go on to describe certain innovations that were deployed ultimately by councils, including online classes, socially distanced activities in parks. Are there any other examples that you can share with us that were able to be used?
There was a range of things that councils did in terms of switching from delivery in person to trying to do things online, and that included a range of different facilities and cultural institutions that local authorities are running. So libraries trying to shift some of the work that they did, museums again shifting to making sure that some of their exhibitions and things like that could be accessed online, and of course libraries trying to increase the number of e-books that they were able to provide and lend out.
Thank you. You've cast forward a little bit there to cultural institutions. There's a huge amount of crossover, so it's interesting that you mentioned those particular services going online at this point. We will come back to that. But one point you make is that these services that councils were able to come up with didn't actually generate income, and so the financial challenges that you've already described, they would have remained significant.
They did. The work that jointly with Sports England, which they did over the early parts of the lockdown period in 2020, suggested that somewhere between the financial impact on the leisure sector would be somewhere between 700 million to £1 billion worth of expenditure, and that they would need something like that in terms of the funding to be able to stabilise. So while the funding that was provided later on in 2020 was welcome, obviously to a degree it didn't match what we estimated was going to be the full impact of the financial costs of shutting down these facilities.
Thank you. One final point that I wanted to ask you about before we move to Ms Dickey for some of her insights. As services were reopened following the lifting of lockdown, you've suggested that older demographics in particular, as well as a number of different groups, were slow to return to using services. Why was that?
I think because, understandably, the messaging was about, at the time, was about looking after your health, being careful, looking after the NHS, and that people, understandably, didn't want to take risks with their own health. They weren't sure what circumstances some of the facilities would be reopened under, and whether or not they would be entirely safe. So I can imagine there was a degree of reticence on people's part to return until they were completely sure that the facilities they were going to be managed in a safe way.
Thank you very much, Mr Norris. Moving to Ms Dickey, you deal with leisure facilities at paragraphs 3.1 to 3.8 of your statement. And you also note significant work done in Scotland to prioritise the reopening of these facilities. And you refer to cross-cutting benefits at paragraph 3.3. Again, it seems that they include benefits to individuals in terms of health and benefits to the economy. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Can you expand at all about how that operated in Scotland, or what your particular concerns were in Scotland?
So I think, as the inquiry has heard in previous modules, COSLA jointly sponsors Public Health Scotland, and one of the big focuses of local government in Scotland is in and around about tackling inequality. When we consider inequality, our first starting point is place. So access to leisure and culture facilities in place is incredibly important so that our residents across Scotland are able to not just survive but thrive. I think the point that Mark's already made about access to facilities as close to home as possible is really important, and it's something that I think the work outlined in my statement demonstrates that our members were telling us very early on in the pandemic that these services were at risk, and that we needed to not just maintain them and sustain them, they needed to come back very quickly as we progressed through the pandemic.
Thank you very much. Later at paragraph 3.21 of your statement, you note another feature of the impact in this sector during lockdown, and that's that some of these leisure centres were closed, but some of them were also being used as testing facilities or for vaccination centres with staff deployed elsewhere. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Sorry, go on.
The very nature of our sports and leisure facilities across Scotland is that they are centred within our communities. They are tried and tested. They normally have access and parking facilities, so they were well known across our communities, and the access levels were good for differing access requirements. But there was a point where we had to think about transitioning away from these being test and trace facilities and vaccine facilities and put them back into normal use because we could see the inequalities that we were facing across our communities.
So these sorts of areas were hugely important in communities, so that the loss of them during the pandemic for vaccination or other services had quite an impact on communities. Would it be fair to say?
I think that's good.
Now, thank you very much for that, Ms Dickey. Can I move to you, Dr Llewellyn? You cover this ground at paragraphs 14 to 29 of your statement, and some of that is over broader areas, including cultural institutions. So I'll come back to it later. But in terms of leisure facilities specifically, you also note prolonged closures, reduced physical activity, particularly for those without access to alternatives, and also financial strain on facilities. And that is at paragraph 27 of your statement. Is that a fair summary of the issues that you've described?
I think it is. But in paragraph 27, we talk about the loss of the impact on physical activity. We touch on the impact on mental health as well as physical health, and the financial strain, the loss. But I think we've also referred to the to issues of social prescribing, and it's something that's easily overlooked. As an association, we at the time ran the exercise referral scheme, which is a scheme which prescribes physical activity rather than prescribing conventional medicines to deal with chronic conditions, chronic heart and respiratory conditions. It was delivered by the 22 authorities across the leisure sector in Wales, and it was one of those things that was lost, that could be easily overlooked. And there are significant health benefits that go beyond the physical activity in terms of providing social networks for people who are often elderly and in a vulnerable state. There were efforts to compensate, to make online provision, but I think it was a very significant loss. And in terms of going forward, the preventative and early intervention agenda, I think there are significant lessons there.
Yeah, so you've described the National Exercise Referral Scheme, and that's part of social prescribing, which the inquiry's already heard from Sarah Hughes at Mind about the importance of those sorts of initiatives in terms of improving physical health. Thank you very much for that. An additional feature of the impact that you also noted in that section of your statement is that the workers who were normally involved in providing those services were then redeployed, for instance, to provide test and trace or shielding. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct as well.
Now, one thing that you describe in your statement is that the largest leisure centre in North Wales, Deeside Leisure, was assigned for use as an emergency hospital. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Can you tell us a bit about...
Yeah, if I elaborate. When leisure centres and other facilities as well were closed by local authorities, they were very adept and fleet of foot in terms of repurposing, redeploying staff. Some were furloughed, but redeploying staff and then repurposing some of the facilities. They may have been used for testing. They may latterly be used for the vaccinations as well. We've mentioned Deeside Leisure Centre in Flintshire because it's an interesting example because it was used for different purposes. At one point, it was used as an emergency hospital as well. But there are consequences, and there were consequences to that, which meant that once the restrictions were lifted, it took a significant amount of time before that facility was back on stream, and there were significant costs to it as well. We've highlighted that example, but that occurred in numerous other places across Wales as well.
And the sort of costs that you might be referring to include the sorts of things that Mr Norris was describing earlier, the fact that if you switch off a swimming pool's filter, it costs £20,000 to switch it back on again.
Yeah, all sorts of... there were significant costs there and remedial work because of the adaptations that have been made as well.
Would you agree with Ms Ducky that these sorts of centres... they play a huge role in communities, so any form of disruption has a sort of lasting effect and a significant impact?
Yeah, it's something we've tried to highlight in our evidence, but it's easily overlooked. In terms of my reference to social prescribing, part of the benefit, I think, as you would have heard from other witnesses, is the networking opportunities, the other opportunities for social interaction that provision provides as well. And the same thing happens with leisure provision, whether it's provided directly by local authorities or in partnership with other community groups as well. There's a significant loss beyond just the immediate physical activity that takes place in those settings.
Thank you very much, Dr Llewellyn. Now, finally, Ms Allen, you've discussed leisure facilities specifically, along with sports and cultural activities as part of a section at paragraphs 27 to 34 of your statement. And at paragraph 33, you also describe a severe impact on people's access to all these services in Northern Ireland over a prolonged period of time. And at paragraph 34, you also highlight research from others like UK Active, Sport England. Would it be fair to say that the position in Northern Ireland was very similar to what the other witnesses have described?
Yes, absolutely. But I would potentially add that that community level sports played as much of an impact in the improving of physical and mental well-being as the actual physical leisure centres. So whether it was around pitches or around community centres, councils were providing support to those services as well, and often they were the backbone of communities in the absence of structured community organisations. And very much to pick up on Dr. Llewellyn's point that they are more than leisure provision, that they are meeting places, they are social places. And I think it's fair to say that in Northern Ireland we didn't appear to have the same difficulty in prioritising their return after the Northern Ireland Executive published its plan for return to activities. Sport, leisure and cultural institutions were prioritised very quickly with clear steps to enable them to return in a controlled and a responsible manner.
Thank you. I'm going to move back to you, Mr. Norris. You then deal with sport and physical activity more broadly at paragraphs 88 to 114, beyond leisure centres. Again, I'm not going to cover all of that ground, but picking up the key points, you describe the moment when you were permitted to exercise in parks for an hour a day during lockdown as a lifeline to many, particularly those who had no outside space. Is that correct?
It is, and I think we rediscovered at that point the benefit of local parks and green spaces in our communities, and as others said, the fundamental role that they play in terms of bringing communities together.
And you've referred there to parks. I want to move on to talk a bit more about parks now. They were kept open, but there were still quite a lot of concerns, it appears, about people not adhering to guidelines, which is something that would have impacted on councils and their staff. Is that correct?
Yes, it would have done.
And a particular feature that you mention is the issues that arose with tourist destinations or on bank holidays. You'd get large numbers, would that be correct, that would present challenges for councils?
It did. So, particularly in the summer of 2020, when obviously international travel was difficult and people were looking at staying within the UK, I remember a number of discussions ahead of things reopening in that summer with officials and also with local authorities about what the pressures would be. And then as people went away for into the summer, the pressures that were put on parks, particularly our national parks, and making the use of those, which caused great that people were appreciating them, and especially in the numbers that went out to them. But that did cause some conflicts in terms of users and also local communities based in those parks as well, which had to be balanced, and it was a difficult position for local authorities and parks authorities and the police to manage.
So you've mentioned that sometimes you would close parks in response to specific police requests, and you also managed, the councils managed closure of car parks as part of the way in which this was dealt with. Mr. Norris, I think you've had sight of our roundtable report on sport and leisure. There was an account in there of people descending essentially on certain areas, and there being a degree of resentment about this, especially when facilities like car parks and so forth, public toilets were closed. Is that the sort of thing that you recall coming up during this period?
It is, in particular, again, as I said, in the summer of 2020, it was a particular issue in spaces, those places on the coast, but also in the national parks, where parking was tight because of the sheer number of people who were visiting, and trying to manage that and ensure people were safe, socially distancing. All of those things made it much more complicated than it normally would have been. But again, it was good that people were finding out and appreciating the natural beauty of the UK.
Again, sticking with the issue of parks and national parks, you mentioned in your statement that you co-produced detailed guidance on managing parks with people such as the National Trust. And in summary, that's because the guidance didn't appear to be sufficiently detailed to cover many of these challenges that you've described. Is that fair?
It is, yes.
Now, also in your statement, you provided a large number of case studies to illustrate the impact of the efforts that was made to keep parks open and things like that, one of which is about the Walsall Metropolitan Borough Council, and you touch on that at paragraph 99. And what you say is that during lockdown, visits to parks in that area increased by 40% compared to the previous year. And you say that's significant because in the same area, around 40% of residents in the town centre don't have access to a garden. Can you just expand a little bit about the point you're making there?
It goes back to that point about the importance of parks and open spaces and being able to go out and physically exercise. And when the restrictions in place were such that you could only go out for a limited period of time, you had to be socially distancing and people keeping in their bubbles. For those people who didn't have access to gardens or spaces like that, parks and green spaces provided by the local authority were a crucial resource for them to be able to go to, which is why you saw such significant increases over time. It was a mixed picture, I think, fair to say, in terms of usage. Initially, people were kind of reticent about going out. I think there's some of the information saying that some of the parks were relatively deserted in the first few weeks of lockdown, but then that started to pick up. And as you said, in places like Walsall, we saw significant increases in usage over the summer and over 2020.
So, as you say, people didn't need to leave their house, but you found that these facilities being opened did, it's fair to say, demonstrate that people had a real need to get fresh air and to leave the house.
Yes.
Thank you. You've also noted again some research, paragraph 100 from Sport England, that noted a particular impact on women and on the disabled whose activity levels declined. Can you give us any detail about any measures that were effective in getting these groups more involved in outside services?
I think it's difficult to give any kind of particular details. I think from our point of view, local authorities and our member authorities were looking keen to make sure that everybody could access those parks and be able to use them. But obviously, at the time when you've got social distancing requirements and trying to keep people safe and apart from each other, makes particular the way you operate a park changes, and as you would have seen from some of the examples in the witness statement, our member authorities implemented a range of measures which tried to ensure that they were safe and usable, and make the parks accessible, which may include in some instances changing the physical layout of the parks to try and make them accessible to people who could use them. But yes, it wasn't an easy time given the rapid pace at which we moved from life as normal into lockdown and then navigating all of that.
I think you mentioned Rugby Borough widened paths in their parks to facilitate social distancing.
Indeed, yes.
Just turning to that, when facilities did reopen, presumably councils had to move at pace. You'd have additional costs of hiring staff to ensure compliance with social distancing. And also the signage. There was a lot of signage that seemed to go up overnight. Presumably, that would have created a great deal of burden on councils.
Certainly, for the teams running and responsible for managing parks, they had to respond very quickly. And one of the issues, all the issues you've outlined, are ones that councils had to take into account. And I think the other one would have been probably the pace at which government was making decisions, and that councils were then responding to that, and that being able to, you described it, moving at pace was sometimes necessary as government made decisions relatively quickly at times about what was happening, and then councils having to respond, and the guidance not being entirely clear in all instances about how things should be managed.
Now, Mr. Norris, talking about pace, I'm asked to remind witnesses to speak slowly, because we have a stenographer who's trying to keep up with all of the valuable evidence that you've been giving. I'm hoping that because you're on the table, that you're close enough to the microphone, but if you were to slow down a bit, I think it would be a lot easier for her or him to get a note of what you're saying. Thank you very much. You were talking about costs, or other costs. Perhaps I could ask if any of the rest of the witnesses have anything to add. Costs of PPE, intensive cleaning, these sorts of things. Were they completely unforeseen costs and measures that had to be deployed? Perhaps I could ask you, Dr. Llewellyn, first, then I'll move to the other witnesses about how councils were able to manage these costs.
Yeah, there were significant unforeseen costs. I think that is the case. But we've in previous modules and in other evidence, I think we've highlighted the effectiveness of the hardship fund provided by the Welsh Government and how responsive the Welsh Government was to costs incurred by local government. Both the loss of income and the additional costs from, throughout the COVID period. And I think in previous modules we've highlighted that process worked incredibly effectively. It was developed relatively quickly, and again highlighted the significance and the importance of a close working relationship.
Well, Dr.
between local
Llewellyn, you
government and
remind
Welsh
me that
Government.
this is territory that's probably
Yeah.
more appropriate to evidence you've already given, but it's a good reminder. I think in terms of the point I'm trying to explore with you, the impact on councils really of moving at pace, and that probably is something we will come to when we deal with the workers for the council, the pressure on them, I suppose. So I can probably move forward again to Mr. Norris. Can I ask you to consider what you've explained at paragraphs 119 and 120? And this is some research conducted by Public Health England prior to the pandemic. Is it right that showed that ethnically diverse communities were less likely to have good access to green infrastructure?
It did, though it's worth noting that I think within the public health report itself, it caveated some of that by saying that it was difficult when they were doing a literature review to find some of the evidence that they needed. So I think,
Data gaps being the
there are
issue.
data gaps there,
Yes.
definitely, and I think that's what Public Health England highlighted in their report.
And you also refer to another piece of research published by Fields and Trust, and that's in 2022. And again, that was on the same theme, that access to parks specifically was highly unequal for people in more economically deprived areas. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
Ms. Dickey, turning back to your statement at paragraph 3.33, you cover this same point, and it's part of a broader comment, which you've already touched on, and that's that the pandemic exacerbated existing inequalities in access to physical activity and cultural participation. And you say that older adults, people with long-term health conditions, children and young people, disabled individuals, and those living in areas of socio-economic deprivation were the most significantly affected. I think you've already expanded a little about this earlier in your evidence. Is there anything more to add at this point?
No, I suppose just to say that what you've heard from colleagues in the other LGAs was very much how it played out in Scotland. I think the other thing that hasn't come up but was really important in and around about grassroots that Alison touched on was the gender imbalance. So a lot of the grassroots community sporting activity that goes on is particularly skewed towards men and boys. So we were having to balance between access to leisure centres and bringing forward online classes and spaces to cover our community. But we were also having to balance that between the fact that some grassroots sporting authorities were very much looking after the interests, sadly, of one gender. So we had lots of conversations in Scotland in and around about how could we get things like dancing classes and gymnastics classes and these other things up and running. So I suppose there's a real tension there in the kind of who was playing the sport or who was taking part in the leisure and what was actually happening when they were there. So team contact sports a conversation was taking place in one place because it was outdoor, and then you were having a conversation in a separate space because it was a dancing class that would take place indoor. So I think there was a real tension and an inequality being built in there in terms of the discussions on who was playing and what they were playing and the environment that they were playing that in. And there was a real balance to go through that in conversations with our colleagues in government.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dickey. Now, I'm going to move on to cultural institutions now. But as your last statement demonstrates, there's a significant overlap between this and what we've already heard about sports and leisure facilities, so I'm not going to cover that ground again. But continuing with you, Ms Dickey, paragraph 3.9 of your statement, you say that as a representative body for local government, COSLA consistently advocated for the protection and sustainability of services including libraries, museums, theatres and community arts programmes. So presumably these are features of community life that you were particularly concerned should be maintained so far as possible.
Absolutely, and I suppose that goes back to the point I made earlier about the starting position for local government being very much built in place. So historic buildings, access to institutions and areas that have been part of community life for hundreds of years in some cases were incredibly important. And it was important that we were trying to advocate for place-based communities, but also communities of interest, so things that were important to different parts of our communities in different parts of the country.
And just want to pick up on a new point that you make at paragraph 3.35, and that is about the particular impacts on rural communities, and that's both in terms of the closure of both sports and cultural facilities. Could you expand on that, please?
Yeah, so I suppose in many cases in a remote and rural area, there may well only be one sports facility, and there may only be one leisure centre. You're pretty likely to have your sports fields attached to your parks, and we've just had a conversation on parks. The other thing is that in rural areas, the distance that needs to be travelled between habitations can be long distances. And later on in the pandemic, when we moved to the tiering system, you could have two local authorities that were right next to each other, with one with leisure facilities and access to sport open and one not. But the ability to travel between the two areas was constrained by the kind of population level restrictions on travel that had been put in. So certainly in our remote and rural areas, the ability to cater for communities to the same extent that in our more kind of populated areas was certainly something that we raised across the board.
And you mention also there were particular impacts, noting those features such as travel on people with disabilities and health conditions. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And the other example that comes to mind was in and around about the closure of swimming pools for many people living with a disability or anyone who's potentially a bit infirm. Perhaps a swimming pool is the only exercise that they can safely take, but we had closed the swimming pool and closed their ability to actually be hoisted into a pool. So cold water swimming wasn't something that was going to be useful across the piece. So I think it was that, going back to that point about inequality, the population level measures that were applied, as you know, in the inquiries heard in Scotland, were taken down a kind of 4 harms route. But within each of those harms, there needed to be an understanding of people's specific circumstances. And that talks to the point, I think, that's come up already in this module to the inquiry. It's not just a lack of data, it's a lack of an ability to then layer that data together to understand a subset of the population that might be affected by something as specific as living with a disability and closure of swimming pools. So it's the lack of data, but the lack of ability to layer that data, I think, didn't help.
Thank you so much, Ms Dickey. I will turn now back to Dr Llewellyn on a similar point, but as you've given such an extensive answer, probably take it a little quicker with you, Dr Llewellyn. You've said there that the closure of leisure centres, gyms and cultural venues, so all of the services within this section, it was significant and extensive, and you also touched on vulnerable people, including those who are self-isolating, being particularly impacted, as Ms Dickey's explained. You then say that many bespoke cultural and leisure activities provided for people with physical and learning disabilities and for ethnic groups and others with other protected characteristics were impacted. And you say that this impacted on social connectivity. Could you give us perhaps some examples of the sorts of bespoke activities you mean?
Yeah, services were provided online. One of the things we've touched on before is the fact that local authorities are in touch with their communities. Elected members, officers, they tend to live in their communities and they understand the local needs. Very often strategies are set nationally by national governments, but the role of local government is to interpret them according to local circumstances. And in this instance, that's what authorities did. Something we haven't touched on, we mentioned in the evidence, is the state of the provision at the start of the pandemic, and it is worth reinforcing and bearing in mind that all of these facilities were suffering from an underinvestment over the 10 or 15 years prior to the pandemic. In terms of some of the solutions, we mentioned some of the arrangements, the provision made in West Wales by some of the North Wales Authority, Flintshire, Denbighshire.
Sorry, Dr Llewellyn, could I ask you just to slow down a tiny bit?
Yeah.
Thank you.
We've referred to various solutions that were developed by authorities across Wales, but they were the community and locally based, so that they would liaise with voluntary groups within their communities, different kinds of voluntary groups, different responses, all conforming to national guidance, but being sensitive to both local needs and capacity within those communities. So every council in Wales will have a different relationship with their communities, but also with the networks and the community associations and voluntary groups within the areas. As an association, we work very closely with the the WCVA, but in terms of direct service provision and responses to the pandemic, it was all dependent on the local relationships within those communities. And in our evidence, I think we list a number of examples of where local provision was developed to respond to local demand.
Thank you very much. You've specifically mentioned at paragraphs 30 to 33 of your statement a number of case studies on how libraries were used. That seems to have been quite an important part of what you considered or councils considered needed to be provided. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
And
yes.
you say that cultural venues act as third spaces to enable and encourage social connection. I think that we've already touched on this, that the library is a place to meet people. It's not just there to provide the service of a library. It's also something to do with social connectivity, and that was lost during the pandemic due to closures and restrictions.
It is easily overlooked, I think, and as some of my colleagues have touched on already as well, rurality, sparsity, deprivation, demographics, all of these factors have a differential impact. Transport costs as well. People living in rural communities, there are fewer facilities. The cost of accessing those or travelling is significantly more as well. In deindustrialised areas or in more urban areas, there can still, even if facilities are present, there are still impediments which are rooted in socioeconomic factors. Also cultural issues as well, and we've already touched on as well the impact on minority groups and disabilities as well. So there's a very layered and nuanced effect here as well.
One additional feature you've described is that some of the activities that would have been going on in these spaces and which councils tried to protect were intergenerational programmes such as mentoring and ways in which people, old and young, could connect together in the community. Is that something that you consider was important?
Yeah, really, really important in terms of social cohesion. And when we touched on leisure provision, we mentioned the fact that there's a greater impact than simply the contact period and the time that the particular activity takes. There are a whole range of social interactions, many of which are intergenerational, which wrap around the sporting or the leisure activity.
Thank you. Mr. Norris, you cover cultural impact at paragraphs 84 to 88 of your statement, and you also say that libraries were quickly recognised as important providers of support for people, particularly those who are digitally excluded. You have given some examples of what libraries were used for, places for people to apply for benefits or other support, and you also mention that there was some live streaming in private spaces of funerals. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
And you say that there were some limited financial supports for these, but activities were still significantly constrained, particularly grassroots clubs.
They were, yes.
And another point you make at paragraph 89 of your statement is about volunteers. So you say there that many of the services were reliant on a volunteer base that may have been drawn from people who were then required to shield. Is that correct?
It is, and it applies, I think, across to some of the other case studies that we've got within the witness statement, which highlight the reliance that local authorities make of volunteers who contribute significantly to be able to run some of the leisure and cultural facilities that councils are responsible for. And yes, the demographic tends to be people who would have been, by virtue of age, for example, people who are going to be advised to shield.
So just to expand a bit, you're talking about people that may not be employed, but they're using their time to provide services to the community as volunteers. They tend to be older, and during the pandemic, their service was lost because they couldn't go out and do that anymore.
Indeed, and I think that's a broader impact that came from the pandemic. Was that not applied not just to local authorities directly ourselves and the volunteers that councils rely on, but also when you look at the picture in respect of voluntary organisations themselves in the community, again, their demographic and some of the volunteers they relied on, they suffered from the fact that as we went into lockdown and people were advised to shield, etc., that they lost a good deal of their volunteer workforce as well.
And that's made a real difference to the services councils could offer and on their financial situation.
Yes.
Now, I'm coming to the end of my questioning on the impact on sport, leisure and cultural institutions. However, as I mentioned earlier, you've all been provided with extracts from the statements that the inquiry has received from the sports and arts councils in all 4 nations. Can I just get one section of one of those statements up on screen? And that is from Richard Archibald of Sport Northern Ireland. And what he says there is we should perhaps view the world during the pandemic as a world that sought to provide the basics for the whole population. We live in a world of wants and desires, or commercialism and consumerism, where trends and fashions dictate so much of the world around us. The pandemic forced us to reconsider our lives and reevaluate our priorities, our ability to get out for a walk, access to safe places and spaces for activity and social interaction, a reconnection with nature, and our communities being supported in a variety of new ways by the local sports club volunteers. We can use this to highlight what the fundamental components of our future society should be. So, Ms Allen, I'm just going to come to you first because it comes from the Northern Ireland Arts Council, though I'm sure what he means there isn't confined to Northern Ireland. Do you consider in the round that some of the services that we've spoken about are part of the basics or the fundamentals, or, as he puts it, how society should be?
Yes, absolutely, and I think it speaks to the multifaceted nature of what a healthy society based on general well-being looks like. And I think I couldn't have put it any more meaningfully myself in terms of how it's been presented. I think just though the general sense is, I think we all said that at that point, that we would be forced to reevaluate our lives and our priorities. I suppose there is a concern potentially amongst the political representatives that my organisation represents, that we've lost a little bit of that sense and the opportunity to gain on that. So perhaps the outcome of the inquiry will allow us to refocus on those things.
Mr. Norris, could I ask you to take a look at part of your statement, paragraph 104 of your statement, INQ 000661279, page 28. And I should say I forgot to mention the inquiry number of the earlier extract, and for the record, that is INQ 000661781, page 28, 6.13. But back to your point, could I just ask you to take us through the points that you make about unexpected benefits in the context of parks, please?
Well, I think I'd agree completely with the statement there from sports bodies within Northern Ireland, but also in terms of, I think it shows that, and we learnt from the fact that parks are a very valuable institution and resource within local communities, that the value that they provide and the resources that they give to the whole of the community are really important. And I think broadly, I think we started to recognise some of that came out of the pandemic in terms of what was there and available on people's doorsteps and much more connected with what was happening at a very local level and what was there in their community that they could use. I think there's a one broader point I just pick up in terms of Alison's point earlier, is that as well as that, the cultural and the leisure facilities that make not only to local well-being and the well-being of communities, but do play a fundamental role in keeping those local communities going, but also provide economic and resources and attractions that draw in people to the local economy as well. So the role that they play is fundamental to the very much of what happens at a local level, and both in terms of culture, leisure and sport facilities, they're fundamental to what happens in local communities. And my colleagues, I think from the LJ's perspective, it's really important that we continue to value, treasure and invest in those in the future.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, just to come back to you, Mr. Key, have you got anything to add in terms of those closing points?
So I think I absolutely agree with the first quote that was put up there from our colleagues in Northern Ireland. I suppose in November 2021, COSLA launched our broader vision for recovery from the pandemic, and it was entitled Live Well Locally. And I was struck when you brought that extract up there that every single thing that was described happens in a local place, not in a national context. So I've referenced place a number of times, place, belonging and community. So I think as far back as November 2021, COSLA were thinking similar things to our colleagues in Sports Northern Ireland.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Llewellyn.
If I could make a point, I think what this discussion and what the pandemic highlighted is the value that people attach to museums, archives, libraries, leisure centres, parks, recreation and so on. The frustration for local government, which was highlighted in this discussion, is that these are all discretionary services. When budgets are cut, these are often the areas that are cut, despite the fact that all the evidence shows that the public value these services more than any other. Something like 80% of local authority spending in Wales goes on social care, adult and children, and education. And there's always a tension there. If budgets are cut, then these are the areas that suffer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Llewellyn. I'm going to leave my questions in this area now, and I'll move on to the next topic that you were asked about, which is the impact on particular vulnerable groups. Now, the inquiry has already heard expert and other evidence about particular vulnerable groups, so I'm going to endeavour not to repeat evidence that we've heard before. I'm going to, in particular, pick up a few points in this area that some of the core participants have asked me to clarify with you. So I do not imagine that we will be very long in this area, but I shall try and get through it before we have our break. Turning again first to you, Mr. Norris, you cover this from paragraphs 122 onwards of your statement, and you've already addressed the work that the LGA did in relation to shielding in previous modules. Picking up then on some just additional points relevant to this module, At paragraph 134, you describe a number of vulnerable groups, the clinically extremely vulnerable cohort, the non-shielding vulnerable people, and people who were vulnerable due to self-isolating. So the point there, Mr. Norris, is that you are illustrating and highlighting that there are people who were vulnerable beyond those who are on the shielding list. Is that correct?
It is, and I think the inquiry's already heard from evidence earlier on this week that obviously people were making individual decisions about whether or not they needed to shield and what was the best thing for them to do for their own personal safety and health. So yes, there was cohorts of people that local authorities worked with, wanted to support, which went beyond that identified by the government and in terms of clinically extremely vulnerable.
And but carrying on with questions with you, Mr. Norris, if I can ask you again just to speak a little bit louder and slower. At paragraph 136, you give some more examples of people who you might describe as vulnerable as a result of the pandemic, beyond those on the shielding list. For example, those working in the gig economy, those working on low incomes, and particularly families who may have been quite reliant in terms of feeding their families on school meals. Is that fair to say? There are other examples of vulnerability?
There are, and again, I think as the inquiry for this module's already heard some evidence in relation to those groups.
And you go on to say, particularly at the start of the pandemic, it was necessary for councils to use their local networks to understand who those groups were. And what you mean by that are voluntary community and social enterprise groups, or VCS, is that correct?
It is, yes.
And is the way they did that through doing things such as monitoring food bank use or advice lines, inquiries, and passing that back and sharing that information?
Yes, it was that important point about sharing local information, local intelligence, and colleagues have already made reference to the position that local authorities are in, and both councillors and officers living in their communities and being able to establish those networks very quickly with local organisations who would have the intelligence and data that they needed to access to be able to identify who needed support.
Yes, and you've identified then a large number of schemes and funds deployed to assist. Those are at paragraph 147. I don't need to ask you about those, but later in your statement at paragraph 193, you described that those without recourse to public funds also face particular issues. I think you've addressed that in your Module 9 statement. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
I think there's one question for you from somebody else later on. Turning to Ms Dickey, you also address that cohort in your statement, and that is at paragraphs 4.11 to 4.14 and 4.30. And it's right, Ms Dickey, that you've set out the impact on vulnerable groups in a great deal of detail throughout section 4 of your statement?
That's correct, yes.
I don't have any questions for you about the detail, but I am asked to clarify something that you mention at paragraph 8.3 of your statement. Here you have also described how councils had to rapidly identify and support people at higher risk who were not part of the official shielding list. And you've referred to research conducted with local authorities examining who in the non-shielded risk group was receiving support. So, Ms Dickey, does that mean that the focus at a national level on the clinically extremely vulnerable had an impact on those who weren't formally advised to shield, in that the councils were required to identify them and that they may have been clinically vulnerable and at risk of severe outcomes, but not on the list?
Yeah, I think that was the case, and I think given the comments I've already made about population level restrictions, you may have had a person living in one local authority who was not shielding or did not require to shield, but they did require their daughter, who was in another local authority, to come and help them pick up their prescription or walk the dog or anything. And I suppose that goes back to the point that Mr Morris has just made, that local authorities set up helplines. We used our local networks. We spoke to our churches, our food bank organisations to say, what have you got coming through? And if I go back to the start of the conversation, that indeed were the jobs that many of our staff who were previously worked in leisure centres were doing. They were doing wellbeing calls and, going and picking up prescriptions and dropping them off. So there absolutely was an impact on those that were asked to shield as per the clinical guidance, but there was a knock-on impact to others across the communities that councils picked up pretty quickly.
Thank you. Dr. Llewellyn, you described the role of the WLGA in delivering the shielding programme from paragraphs 48 to 51 of your statement, or your council's rather, and you also describe at paragraph 52 the test, trace and protect strategy for Wales, which you say was delivered by health boards and local authorities in partnership. I am asked to clarify one matter with you about that strategy, which you describe as the Protect work stream later in your statement at paragraph 57. There, you say that Protect officers were able to draw on local knowledge and expertise to support people shielding, isolating or living on their own and others. Could you expand a little on how those who are part of this wider cohort of clinically vulnerable, though not on a list, were protected? And I note that you have sent out some particular initiatives at paragraph 61, which you could perhaps explain a little bit more about.
Yeah, I think the test, trace and protect arrangement worked reasonably effectively in Wales. It took a little bit of time to establish, but it reflected central and local government and health colleagues working very effectively together. It touches on the point that I mentioned earlier about councils, both officers and members, being best placed to understand the needs of their communities, and because they have a direct face-to-face relationship with the people they represent and members of their communities, they're able to make assessments about vulnerability in a way that maybe a conventional clinical assessment might not capture. So what we've in our evidence, we've listed the kind of interventions, the helping to deliver food packages, linking up with transport, providing links with established community networks, all of which would have helped those people in their vulnerability. And then we've listed a few examples. The one in West Wales, there's another example of the West Wales one is Friends in Need. In North East Wales, Denbighshire, Wrexham and Flintshire councils were able to connect vulnerable people with I think around 40 community networks. We've also referred to an initiative in Blaenau Gwent, where there was a mapping exercise was undertaken, again, to identify the capacity within those communities, the voluntary and community networks that were available to provide support. We've mentioned those, but it's a pattern that prevailed across Wales throughout the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Llewellyn, for that clarification. Ms. Allen, I'm also asked to clarify one matter with you on this group. You've described at paragraph 41 of your statement that vulnerable individuals, other than those formally advised to shield, who required support or assistance, had the opportunity to self-refer through a regional helpline, through council helplines, or through engagement with local community voluntary organisations. The question raised was around whether self-referral alone was adequate to locate these individuals. But is it correct that you are also describing additional means to do that, similar to what the other witnesses have described?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the particular reference to self-referral was in respect of the protection of dignity in these circumstances. So recognising that whilst people may not have met the criteria for the medical criteria for shielding, that the individual circumstances of individuals and families was very private. So I'm sure it's implicit for us all that councils took very wide definitions and wide interpretations, and also sought to invest in local community organisations who know their people intimately much better, often in many cases, than council officers will and do as well. So it was implicit around protection of dignity, that self-referral.
Thank you. So it wasn't the only way.
Absolutely.
There were other ways. Okay, thank you. And I want to move now to another vulnerable group, that is victim survivors of domestic abuse. Again, we've heard a lot of evidence about this, and what I'm asked to do is clarify if there's anything from a local government perspective. And I'll ask all of you in turn. And perhaps I'll start with Ms. Dickey, because in relation to domestic abuse, at the round table on this, I think you attended that, didn't you, Ms. Dickey?
Yes.
And you said something along the lines of, not only did we put people in their own homes with a perpetrator, we took all the services away. Is that was a comment that you made?
Yeah, so I think that was on the basis of the feedback that we had from our domestic violence against women and girls leads across our local authorities. The population level restrictions that were applied were making it very clear that people were expected to stay at home. We then subsequently changed the way we did our education functions. We moved our child protection systems online. We prevented people from accessing libraries, culture, all of the other areas that we've already discussed. I suppose the second end of that conversation was, on top of that, we also applied population level restrictions that prevented informal support networks such as families, relatives, friends coming together. So I think, again, it goes back to what I've said earlier about it's not the individual effect, it's the cumulative effect of a lot of things that are pushing up the risk factor and reducing the kind of mental health, well-being and physical factors there.
Well, perhaps your answer follows from what you just said, but the first question is whether you agree that widespread closures of in-person services and housing and social care teams left many victim survivors of domestic abuse with no safe way to seek assistance from local councils.
I think that's a fair conclusion. And if I go back to the 4 harms approach in Scotland, with the first harm being direct harm from COVID, a lot of the population level restrictions that were driven in and around about preventing harm from COVID. The third harm there was community, and I suppose there was always a balance to be struck between the two. And I suspect that the move to digital services to reduce the movement of COVID across our communities potentially came at the detriment of access to face-to-face services for men, which I'm sure the inquiry's already heard us.
A second part of the question, a brief question, is do you agree that those with no recourse to public funds in that cohort would be a particular risk due essentially to the precarity of their situation and lack of options to escape abuse?
I think that's good.
The question is put to all of you. I'll ask Ms Allen if you've got anything to add or anything that you may disagree with about Ms Dickey's response to that. I can repeat the questions if you wish.
No, I completely agree with the commentary, but I suppose drawing the importance of supporting communities of interest, which Nicola has already made. Obviously, this is a very important community of interest, and I know councils across the UK will have released funding to organisations who specialise and were able to innovate in what were very difficult circumstances.
Dr Llewellyn, anything to add?
Nothing to add. I didn't participate in the roundtable. I have looked through the evidence gathered, as it were, and it is very compelling and does require further interrogation, I think, as well.
And finally, Mr Norris.
I agree with everything my colleagues have said. The only point I would add, I think, is that particularly early on, the messaging that was given out by national government compounded some of the issues for victim survivors in terms of what they understood the position to be, and it wasn't clear to them that actually when it was being said in terms of harms that actually they could leave their home and there would be support provided to them. And certainly from our point of view, a lot of the conversations with government, but with National Police Chiefs Council and national voluntary sector organisations in this space was very much about how do we combat that message earlier on. But I agree with everything else that has been said as well.
And these are features of the roundtable report that the inquiry's always already heard about. My lady, in terms of when we would take a break, there's one small topic under this head, the second head, digital exclusion, which I could cover before we move on to the third topic. Again, housing and homeless is something you've heard a great deal about, so I don't imagine that will take very long. But I could cover a short topic before a break if you were happy to take it at perhaps 2:50.
Yes, of course, certainly.
Thank you. So I will turn now to digital exclusion. Ms Dickey, you mentioned at paragraph 4.28 of your statement that this... Oh, no, I can't... Oh, I can see you on the screen. Are you still connected, Ms Dickey?
Yes.
Great, okay. Here you are. You mentioned at paragraph 4.28 of your statement that this emerged as a critical issue, and you described there various efforts to address this, for instance, devices being provided and training. Can you just expand a little on that about why that was done?
So I think it was done because of the feedback that we were receiving from our professional officers across local government and indeed our elected members, and wholly cognisant of the fact that local government itself had moved a lot of our services online to maintain access to them. We worked in partnership with colleagues in Scottish Government, we worked across local government, and importantly we worked with our colleagues in SCVO in and around about Connecting Scotland. I suppose that was in recognition to the points that we've just covered, that some groups might not have an ongoing relationship with local government, but they may well be receptive to someone reaching out from a third sector organisation or a community organisation. I suppose elsewhere in the statement we've recognised that the pandemic entrenched some of the inequalities. I would put digital exclusion into that basket of things that the pandemic potentially entrenched.
Thank you. And would it be the case, again, I'm asked to clarify this point with you, that disabled people would have been particularly impacted by issues of digital exclusion?
I would suggest disabled people in and amongst other groups were certainly some of the ones that were impacted by that. I think there were a number of things that we started to do digitally during the pandemic that I've referred to in my statement that were positive, and that we have continued, things like registrations around about births, deaths and marriages. But until we can remove the barriers around about digital inclusivity, we need to make sure that it's digital with support for face-to-face access where it's required.
Thank you. Dr Llewellyn, could I ask you to look at paragraph 84 of your statement? We've already touched on it, but could you expand on the issue of digital exclusion as you address it there? And I note that you talk in particular about learning disabilities and the particular impact.
Yes, as you know, I agree with all of Nicola's comments. There's more to digital exclusion. There's a geographic dimension to it in terms of where people are physically located, but there are other aspects to it which relate to a range of different abilities, but age profile and other demographic factors as well. And there is a challenge here, an ongoing challenge for local authorities of trying to digitise services to make them as efficient and as effective as possible to meet demand and to create resilience as well. But there's a recognition that in many cases, the parts of the community that they're trying to access and improve services for suffer a range of different vulnerabilities, which makes it difficult to access those services. There were attempts as well, in addition to the work that authorities did, to work again with voluntary organisations and to seek support within the community to access those services as well.
Thank you. Do you have any other observations about disabled people specifically in terms of disproportionate impact? I'm asked to touch on that because during the course of your statements, disabled people are probably covered in broader observations you've made, but are there any in particular that you'd like to mention specifically concerned with disproportionate impact on disabled people, whether through digital exclusion or otherwise?
Yeah, I think it's clear that there was a disproportionate impact. That efforts were made to address that impact. There were a range of other vulnerabilities as well that made it difficult to access services. And again, it's something that it's part of the learning process, I think, from this experience.
I'll just ask if any of the other witnesses have anything else to add on those subjects, disabled people having a disproportionate impact and digital exclusion.
No.
I see there are no questions. If that's the case, I will just ask you one more question on another topic before we have our break, and that is just something that came up in relation to evidence we heard from a Mr. Singleton yesterday from Faith Action, and he spoke a lot about faith group volunteers working with local authorities. He mentioned a particular example of one council who would be able to ring a particular vicar in a particular community and he would sort food deliveries. We didn't see any reference to working with faith groups in the evidence that local government witnesses have provided. I don't know if any of you have got anything to add to what Mr. Singleton said about the way that faith groups worked during the pandemic to help communities.
Just to add, I think that actually that's a shared experience from the point of view of local authorities in England was that they would have been working very closely with their faith groups as part of their wider voluntary sector colleagues in doing stuff and being heavily reliant on the support and infrastructure that they provide, particularly in terms of reaching groups that they may not have been so easy to reach. So I think probably our agreement, we would agree with what Mr. Singleton was saying in terms of there was existing strong relationships and they were utilised a lot during the pandemic by local authorities.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything else to add?
Could I just
Yes.
add? Yeah, I think we've referenced some of the community initiatives. There's the in Cardiff, Carmarthenshire and Torfaen, where those councils worked with their communities, Cardiff Connects and so on. And I think that they worked closely with a range of different communities, including their faith communities.
Thank you so much. My lady, if that's a convenient moment to stop.
Certainly, I shall return at 3:10.
Thank you. My lady, can you see me and hear me?
I can, thank you.
Thank you. My lady, I move now to the topic of housing and homelessness. Now, we've heard this morning a lot of evidence about that, so I'll try not to cover ground, particularly as we've only recently heard it. So I'll move first of all to Ms. Allen, because there's an additional point to make in relation to homelessness, which is that in Northern Ireland, councils don't have the same remit at the other councils, and you state that at paragraph 46 of your statement.
Yes, that's correct, for both housing provision and homelessness.
Thank you. So I will start again with Mr. Norris. You cover this area in section D of your statement in a lot of detail. Mr. Norris, are you able to move a tiny bit forward where you're sitting? Because I can see you're quite a long way from the microphone. At paragraph 169 of your statement, you describe there the central role that local authorities played in the Everyone In initiative, and you've referred to an estimated 37,000 people being brought in off the streets. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
And you also describe some of the challenges and limitations of implementing the scheme, and you include matters there that you've already put as part of your statement in Module 9. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
So one of the issues that are relevant to the impact in particular is one of a number of issues that are set out in publications. You refer to these at paragraph 190 to 194, various publications from the LGA, and also others such as Crisis. Is it right that they set out some of the many issues that occurred during the operation of this scheme?
They do. They set out in the case of the LGA publications the local authority experience of implementing the scheme.
Thank you. Is one of the issues that many, in particular of the rough sleepers who came into contact with services, had both mental health and addiction issues as well as being homeless? Is that correct?
Yes, and a range of other issues that they were probably in need of support of, particularly around mental health as well.
And this is the reason why identification of partnership working seems to be presented as a key consideration in providing services to the homeless. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, I'm no great expert, and I'm sure the inquiry will have had evidence about it, but those people who were homeless that came in under the schemes the government introduced tended to have a range of issues that needed to be supported with, and that required partnership working across not just local government, but with key colleagues, for example, in and around the health service.
Thank you. Essentially, the point is that this cohort was brought in at pace and they had complex needs that councils needed to deal with.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Turning to Ms Dickey, you cover housing and homelessness again in great detail at section 5 of your statement. And again, at paragraph 5.5, you make the point that local authorities are required to coordinate access to healthcare, mental health services, welfare advice, many different aspects for all of those who are placed in this emergency housing. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And you go on to say at paragraph 5.7 that there was a relatively stable street homelessness population during the pandemic, despite increased demand for temporary accommodation. Is that right?
Yes.
What do you mean by relatively stable?
So I don't think we saw the peaks that were anticipated in and around about the pandemic. I suspect some of that was because access to temporary accommodation was easier during the pandemic, particularly accommodation such as hotels or self-contained accommodation. So we were able to find physical spaces for people to be accommodated. But as Mark's alluded to already, the real challenge was making sure that the wraparound support was available to sustain people in safe accommodation for that.
And as in England, is it fair to say there were some significant problems? For instance, at paragraph 5.15, you mention issues with congregate accommodation and potential risks. Now, Ms Dickey, the inquiry has heard about this issue through its housing and homelessness roundtable, which I think you've been provided with. There was some concern described there about victim survivors potentially being placed with perpetrators in congregate accommodation. Is that the sort of issue that you're referring to?
I think that was one of the issues. It was also placing vulnerable people together in a situation without adequately trained support. A lot of the accommodation that we provided was purchased from the private sector, and just making sure that we had the wraparound, particularly from our third sector services, but also from our statutory services to support people. So there were a number of complex issues going on in that type of accommodation for a number of individuals, and it was a lot and we learned an awful lot, I think, about how we do that. Subsequently in Scotland, we've had similar initiatives over previous winters and things. We were taking some of that learning from the pandemic forward.
Thank you. Now, Dr Llewellyn, in respect of the position in Wales, again, thank you very much for your statement. You cover emergency accommodation for the homeless, which was provided in Wales under the No One Left Out strategy. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And it was similar to Everyone In.
Yeah.
That's at paragraphs 98 to 124 of your statement. Just picking up on one of the issues, at paragraph 99, you say homeless people can be highly vulnerable due to their life experiences and can be suspicious of public agencies and reluctant to accept support in the experience of councils. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. It's the issue there is being sensitive to the circumstances and focusing on the needs of the particular individuals concerned.
And you say that council teams had to show ingenuity, compassion and persistence to achieve what they did through the scheme.
Yeah, that's right.
And again, like the other witnesses, you identify a great deal of complexity and challenge in delivering this. Summarising from paragraphs 106 and 120, they include interpretation of rules around the opening and reopening of hostels and hotels and hostels, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Dealing with the pressures on housing caused by the early prisoner release scheme? Yes?
Yeah, that's right as well. And do you want me to elaborate on
Yes,
some of these
please
points?
do,
Yeah.
yeah.
So in terms of the early prisoner release scheme, at the outset, there were concerns about the potential problems but that might cause. But I think because of there was significant discussion with the UK government during April of 2020 and then subsequently, so some of the concerns were alleviated. And the point to bear in mind here as well is that the people at the interface with in dealing with homelessness and the vulnerable people we've just mentioned, they are experienced professionals who are incredibly sensitive to what they're doing. So I think we need to emphasise the significant contribution the workforce made to making these initiatives successful.
Thank you. The remainder of the points I think we've dealt with already, but I will just run through them. They include engaging with rough sleepers who declined offers of accommodation, antisocial behaviour in shared accommodation, high demand for substance misuse support and limited availability of self-contained accommodation and uncertainties about appropriateness of shared accommodation. Dr. Llewellyn, do you recognise some of the risks that we heard about in the round table and which Ms Dickey has described as well?
Yes, I do. Again, I wasn't at the roundtable session. I read through the evidence and I recognise all that was said there.
Thank you. Now, there will be one additional question for you later, Dr. Llewellyn, about the position with regards to undocumented migrants, but I will not ask you about that. Subject to that, unless any of you has anything further to add to your extensive evidence in writing on this topic, I'll move on. I will move on since there is no additional point made. So the fourth topic is key workers. Mr Norris, turning first to you, LGA has already explained in earlier modules that the LGA disagreed with the way key workers were defined, and the inquiry has heard a lot of evidence about issues like that. What I want to ask you about is what you set out about the impact on key workers, which you address starting at paragraph 199 of your statement. One issue that you highlight at paragraph 202 was essentially the difficulties for local government workers in relation to enforcing restrictions. Is that the issue of abuse that we've heard evidence about, or are there other issues that you recall?
There were a range of issues. I mean, certainly I think at the time we were picking up instances where local authority officers were being abused, but there was also issues in respect of understanding government guidance and how that was being interpreted by different sectors of the economy, for example, but also by local authority officers, and that different interpretations and lack of clarity causing particular issues on the ground where people disagreed about what it was they were required to do.
Thank you. And you also explain from paragraph 211 onwards the impact on councils of the need to shift activity towards COVID-19 specific work. That created a huge amount of pressure on an already stretched workforce. Is that correct?
It is, and particularly on English environmental health and trading standards officers who were expected to assist businesses both in terms of closing and then reopening at a time when over the preceding decade there'd been a considerable reduction in their workforce over that period of time. So they shifted to doing completely different sets of work in terms of what they were normally expected to do when it came to regulating businesses, for example. But one of the issues for them, of course, was the capacity to be able to do that.
Thank you. You also include matters that have been explored in earlier modules, but you describe surveys of staff and dialogue with trade unions about staff safety, availability of PPE, testing and staff capacity. And you describe emanating from dialogue, essentially, joint guidance and circulars being produced. Was that an important part of the pandemic?
It certainly was, and it was part of the ongoing collective bargaining structures that the LGA is responsible for staffing on the employer's side. And I think that having that long-standing relationship with the unions in terms of having that relationship, having the mechanisms in place through the National Joint Councils, for example, around local government services, and having the trust between employers and staff and the unions was an important part of the process in terms of being able to provide local authorities with guidance about how they should interpret government guidance and implement it and protect their workforce. And I think as a result of that, we ended up in a position where through that collaborative process, you saw guidance that was consistently applied because local authorities across England were able to pick up on that and act on it. It was certainly informed by the views of staff and the unions about what should be covered. So it was one where I think there was a certain particular value in having that as a process to enable staff to be able to work safely within a local government environment, accepting that when you've got 800 odd functions within English local authorities and you've got to cover all of that off and also balance a range of health and safety risks at the same time, it's always going to be a matter for local interpretation by local managers as to how you implement some of that.
Thank you very much. Turning now to you, Ms Dickey, key workers are addressed at section 6 of your statement, and you also describe a process of dialogue with unions via the workforce issue groups. Again, workers were facing many challenges, and you describe that at paragraph 6.7. I summarise those as workplace safety, access to PPE, operational continuity, and personal well-being. Is that a fair description of the sorts of issues that you were aware of during this time?
Yeah, I think those three categorisations are really valid. I think we had the role that we played as employers, and we were trying to balance the safety and the well-being of our workforce, and it was hugely important to have our trade unions and our heads of personnel represented in supporting us. We were balancing that carefully against the wants and needs of our communities. We've referenced all of the things that our communities were looking to be opened up and the things that our communities were looking to sustain. And at times, local government was also working in some areas that we would have classified as commercial, so leisure facilities. We had to make all of the same physical changes to open our leisure centres, so screens and other things. So we were definitely working in that employer's role, but we were also in very many professional spaces, and like colleagues elsewhere in the UK, our Trading Standards Scotland team and indeed our environmental health officers were incredibly flexible in turning their attention to try and get the low-risk sectors across Scotland to comply with guidance.
Thank you. You have set out within your statement some particular issues faced by teachers, cleaners, funeral workers, security guards, and some of those are reflected in the discussions that were had at the Inquiry's Roundtable report on key workers. I think you've been provided with that. Are there any particular aspects of particular professions that you would want to expand on or mention in particular?
No, I think those are all really relevant. It shows the diversity of what local authorities in Scotland have statutory responsibility for, and indeed the things that we don't provide statutorily, but we do provide. I suppose the other thing that we were having to factor in there was within those discrete groupings, we had significant differences in gender balance and significant differences in age, and demography. So as well as balancing the wellbeing and safety of the cohort, going back to what they were doing and how they were doing it, we were also having as employers to balance a number of our workforce were shielding across a hugely diverse type of role. So to say it was complex, I think is an understatement.
Of course. Dr Llewellyn, in relation to Wales, your statement covers this topic at section E, and again, you highlight many impacts on key workers. You summarise them at a paragraph 136, and they include, again, I summarise, reducing numbers of employees, closures, issues with PPE, and remote service provision. Is that a fair assessment of some of the main issues?
Yes, I think it is. And I'd echo the comments of my colleagues as well in terms of the pressures. I think the public protection services, training standards, environmental health and so on were incredibly stretched throughout the pandemic and afterwards as well in terms of covering the range of services that they have to provide both internally and externally within authorities and their role, the emerging role during the pandemic. And it is, I know I labour this point, but it is worth bearing in mind that these services were underfunded at the start of the pandemic. And then the other thing I'd like to add is the social partnership dimension. As an association, as local government in Wales, we put a great emphasis on social partnership. We think that those people who provide services and the people who use services understand those services better at an operational level than others at a strategic level. That came to the fore in this instance. And in some of the service areas, local government, as Mark said, delivers 700 to 800 different services. From the outset, in education, we convened a schools social partnership forum, which on occasion met on a weekly basis, which included all of the school and workforce trade unions to talk through some of these issues. At a national level, we had a shadow social partnership forum, which again brought all of the employers and the trade unions together on a regular basis so that we were able to cover all of these issues of concern as quickly as they arose.
And you also describe essentially local government working with others such as unions to produce more tailored guidance in a nutshell, essentially.
Yeah, but again, it's the same principle that civil servants at a national level can't possibly understand what delivering services at a local level entail, and the best people to understand those services are the people who use them and the people who are at the operational end delivering them on a day-to-day basis.
Paragraph 144, you say that consistent themes were issues around workplace capacity, workplace absence, and again, the challenge of staff being absent due to illness, self-isolation and shielding, which I think Ms Dickey picked up on, and you've reflected that there too.
Yeah, again, you know, we in our evidence we mention refuse collection, revenues and benefits sections within authorities and public protection, and at different times they were all stretched beyond anything that their capacity could reasonably cope with, and in almost every instance went above and beyond what could have been expected of them.
Well, you come back at paragraph 148 to pay tribute to the dedication and personal resilience of key workers in those circumstances. Again, you refer to this issue of personal abuse that workers experienced. I don't know if you want to give any particular examples.
I think one of the most common, Mark has referred to parks and other recreational areas. I mentioned the public protection, training standards and environmental health. Again, there were discussions about whose responsibility sometimes it was to make sure there was compliance with some of the guidance. And very often local authorities staff found themselves in situations unexpectedly of having to ensure compliance and you know, it was a regular occurrence that they would get abuse from members of the public and from others because they were put in incredibly challenging, difficult and often unreasonable situations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Llewellyn. Ms Allen, what you've done in your statement at paragraphs 48 to 53 is set out very helpfully the types of workers that were designated as key workers. You've said that you didn't have any data to hand on some of the issues that we're talking about in terms of impact on key workers from their experiences. Is there anything that you can add from the Northern Ireland perspective to what we've been exploring in evidence this afternoon?
So firstly, I would agree with everything that's been said so far, perhaps bring it to life with an example as a former senior officer in Northern Ireland's largest council. The 2 metre social distancing rule was brought in late one evening, but the next morning at 6:30, bin crews were waiting for instruction on how to be able to safely manage those deliveries for very important services to constituents. That brings in safe systems of work. It brings in the really fast redesign of services, understanding the fears and concerns of individuals who are still turning up for work but potentially have vulnerable family members they're concerned about. So the partnership with trade unions and involving staff in the redesign was actually key. So to be able to get those services back out that morning so you weren't dealing with further service failure.
Thank you very much.
The pace was very fast.
Extremely helpful. My lady, we are hearing from the Trade Unions Congress next week, and you have your roundtable report on key workers. I'm not proposing to ask any further questions on this topic of these particular witnesses. So I can now turn to the final topic, bereavement services and funerals. We have extensive evidence on the issue of the impact of funerals and disruption of bereavement services in evidence next week. So this necessarily covers the ground in a somewhat process-driven way, and no disrespect is intended to anyone in doing so. All of the witness statements of the witnesses here today set out in detail the role of local authorities in the provision of those services during the pandemic. And that, Mr Norris, is at paragraphs 228 to 235 of your statement. Ms Dickey, 7.1 to 7.12. And Dr Llewellyn, paragraphs 173, 179 to 181. And Ms Allen covers this at paragraph 54 in particular of your statement. So as I say, I'm not going to take you to those paragraphs, nor will I cover ground that's been reproduced from earlier modules within those statements. So what I will do is ask a few questions about the impact of the disruption of the services. Can I first, Mr Norris, ask you to consider some of the key issues you've identified at paragraphs 237 to 266. The first issue that you touch on is one we've already discussed, and that is issues with guidance. And you say at paragraph 237 there was an issue about distribution to relevant partners. What was the issue here?
The issue was that initially it was distributed through local resilience forums, and
could I ask you again? I'm so sorry. Could you speak a little bit slower?
Sorry. So the issue was that initially that guidance was distributed to local resilience forums, and only through their Resilience Direct system, which has got limited access to it. And the difficulty being that for local authorities to share that guidance more broadly meant that you couldn't take it out of that system in effect. So it was very difficult for councils to be able to share that with key partners that they needed to do so, such as with funeral directors and others that they might want to share that with.
Thank you. And then you also mentioned workforce capacity. It's right to say that that was particularly acute due to the fact that many of the roles in this particular sector, they can't be performed remotely?
No, none of it can be performed remotely. And in the case of, particularly when it comes to crematoria, professional qualified staff needing to operate the crematoria as well, so that with a limited number of staff potentially in each authority, in each local authority run crematoria, having that qualification, you needed to make sure that you had the right qualified staff available to continue to run services, etc. So yes, there was particular issues around workforce capacity.
Now, you've also touched on the impact on coroner's inquest, which had great impact on the bereaved. The inquiry has received separate evidence in relation to that, and so I won't ask you about that. The next issue you touch on is mortuary capacity. And you highlight again a problem that you've highlighted in earlier modules about a lack of data to enable planning. I don't need to cover that ground again, but in terms of the impact of it, you say it meant that some areas reached full capacity quickly and others set up additional capacity that was not then used. Is that correct?
It is, and obviously from a local authority point of view, whether that's the emergency planners, but also staff working who would running both cemeteries and crematoria, want to ensure that the deceased are treated with the proper dignity they deserve. And being able to do that requires, a deal of planning when there is not much mortuary capacity within local authorities. So they're traditionally reliant on hospitals to provide them with that mortuary capacity, and as that became unavailable, needed to make plans to put in place with their own proper mortuary provision. And the lack of data that was being provided about estimates of excess deaths in the early parts of the pandemic meant that councils were having to, at some points, guess what was going to happen and make their own decisions rather than relying on the information being provided by central government at that point.
Thank you. I'll move on to another point. You deal with funerals and describe 3 issues from the local government perspective. First, in relation to not having access to PPE. Was that a particular concern, and particularly in the earlier stages of the pandemic, which you touch on at paragraph 239?
Particularly for local authority staff who would be in the process of doing it, but even more important, I think, probably for funeral directors who would be handling the deceased and bodies and preparing those for the funeral services. And not having them being in a position where obviously they're working in a difficult environment where they're unsure about how the virus might be transmitted in those circumstances, and not being able to access the PPE that they needed. I'm sure that, and I think it's picked up in some of the roundtable information, is concerns were obviously raised, and that had an impact on funeral directors and their staff in terms of preparing funeral services.
Thank you. You also raise an issue about funeral poverty. Did that mean that some families also had an extended wait because of assistance with funding being not provided or pending for the funerals?
It did. So there was instances where I think that expectation was that because access to grants and funding for people who were in a position where they could access that from the government weren't able to obtain it. And potentially were positions where they would have to look to the local authority who have a duty to provide public health funerals where bereaved relatives and families are unable to provide for it themselves.
Thank you. And finally, you discuss the issue of restricted numbers at funerals, and you've set out there very helpfully the phases during which there were restrictions. And again, you describe difficulties with enforcing the restrictions. Now, one particular issue that you raise is that in the initial stages, the lack of any specific gap or cap on attendance, that was actually quite difficult and challenging to explain. Is that correct?
It was for staff running cemeteries and also for running crematoria. They were making very difficult decisions about trying to interpret government guidance, but also trying to ensure that families were able to say farewell to their family members in a way that they wished to, and trying to interpret that and essentially understand and balance risks, both risks to them as staff and ensuring that they wouldn't fall ill, that there would be continuity of service in terms of being able to continue to provide funeral services through cemeteries and also through crematoria was an issue for them. And then also thinking about those who might be attending, some would have been potentially at greater risk than others from contracting COVID, and trying to balance all of that and explain that to members of the public who are obviously in a very distressed state at that point. that they're navigating these complexities made it very difficult, I think, for local authority staff in that particular instance.
So once again, what you're describing is guidance being difficult to interpret, an impact on those working in the sector, and then, of course, on the bereaved.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Key, you refer to this at paragraph 7.11 of your statement, and you say the pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in the funeral and bereavement sector, particularly around mortuary capacity, coordination of services, and the need for consistent standards. Can you expand on what you say there? Were there similar issues to those that we've just heard described by Mr. Norris in England?
Yes, I think there absolutely were. I would again note the remote, rural and island impact. So areas of scarcity of all of the things that you've listed, combined with maybe one or two individuals in a remote, rural or island location having the right qualification or the ability. So we had lots of discussions with our kind of non-urban authorities in and around about that. I think this is one of the few areas in local government where there's a kind of split between the public and the private provision. And I think Mr. Norris referenced the difficulty that in your resilience structures you have all of your public sector partners, but not necessarily private partners, and that included funeral directors in Scotland. Scotland has subsequently put through a number of pieces of legislation in an attempt to move from the reactive crisis approach we saw in processes to a kind of more proactive and regulated approach, and that legislation is contained within our statement. The only other thing I would point out at a Scotland level is that councils across Scotland provide grants through our Scottish Welfare Fund for those who are unable to finance burial or cremation. So we utilise the existing Scottish Welfare Fund, and we're able to provide that support at a Scotland level. And just to say that the application of guidance and family attendance and other things were incredibly difficult across Scotland as well.
So these efforts that you've described were to essentially, during the pandemic, deal with the issues that Mr. Norris has described, for instance, poverty, funeral poverty, and many other issues that I suppose you'd agree that notwithstanding these efforts, many people still experienced great challenges with funerals and bereavement services during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Ms. Allen, you say at paragraph 57 of your statement that there are a huge number of iterations, 20 to 25, I think, of different regulations that applied. Is it fair to say, as with the other nations, councils in Northern Ireland had difficulties implementing and communicating guidance which was changing at speed?
So in Northern Ireland, the pace of change was the main factor, perhaps due to our smaller size, the direct relationships between councils and funeral directors. Councils didn't raise concerns about that with me. The flow of information seemed to work well, but it changed daily, and the ability to communicate that in truly the most difficult circumstances in a sensitive way to families so that they could process and plan for it. That was where the main impact was. The flow of information was there, but it was just the pace was just so fast.
Thank you. Finally, Dr. Llewellyn, your statement covers this topic, paragraphs 174 to 178, 182 to 184 and 190, and I won't go over the points that have already been made. One point I would just ask you about, you say that it was possible to make some compassionate adaptations, and you describe those at paragraph 175, and they include things such as live stream services, use of large screen monitors and video, and some virtual bereavement support groups. Is it your understanding that such adaptations were able to help people to some extent, even though, as you go on to say, the loss of in-person mourning caused incredible distress and prolonged grief?
Before I respond, could I just take the opportunity to express my sympathies again to the bereaved families. I'm conscious that when we give evidence and prepare evidence, it concentrates our minds, but that everybody who has suffered a loss carries that grief with them every day. So again, if I can just repeat our collective sympathies. In terms of the adaptations, and I think a recurring theme in the evidence we've given is the need to allow for some degree of local flexibility, the idea of setting the direction, a strategic direction at a national level, but allowing authorities to interpret that according to the local circumstances and tailor it for the needs of the communities that they represent. And in this instance, whether they're the different faith groups or people with vulnerabilities, I think that level of discretion is really important whilst continue to work within the wider framework.
So my question was about some of these compassionate adaptations. I was asking you whether or not it was your understanding that some of those that you've set out at paragraph 175 had proved of assistance to people despite the loss of in-person mourning.
Yeah, that's definitely my understanding.
And you've also noted there that the need to be aware that restricted attendance might be particularly distressing for those for whom collective mourning is perhaps essential to their faith.
Yeah.
So we heard a bit of evidence from Mr Singleton of Faith Action about that yesterday.
That is the case, and it highlights one of the points we mentioned earlier as well in terms of how challenging and difficult it is sometimes for those people who are having to enforce the guidance.
Thank you. I think that is all that I wanted to ask you about in relation to your description of how councils were impacted in terms of funerals, bereavement services, and we hear more about how the bereaved were impacted in other evidence. So I can move now to the lessons learned that are set out in your statements. Mr Norris, you set it out at at the end of your statement, but in particular at paragraph 275. You've emphasised the importance of co-design in pandemic planning, and just tying together some of the evidence you've given this afternoon. Do you mean by that taking on board the knowledge of local government across the areas that we've explored this afternoon as part of planning?
It's exactly that, and it's Chris's point as well, which is that people, communities, those working and living at a local level better understand what is needed in their particular community than those who will be working in central government or devolved nations in terms of setting overall strategy, and that wealth of knowledge and expertise and experience from people both in local government but also in the communities themselves and that they work with needs to be taken into account in the future when coming to plan for a future pandemic, in making sure that what we put in place and the plans that we have ahead of time are robust and properly able to deal with a range of issues that you've been hearing during the course of this module, so that we are in a better position to support our communities from a local government point of view, but ensure the well-being of everybody who lives in those communities in the future. Of course,
there have already been some recommendations in terms of preparedness, but what you've explained is the impact and how, as I understand it, co-planning or local knowledge can assist in terms of planning going forward and the impact we saw during this pandemic. You've also emphasised in your evidence today about what happened during this pandemic, the importance of partnership with the voluntary sector. That seemed to be, again, part of local knowledge, and it seemed to be a particularly important part of your lessons learned. Is that fair to say?
It is, yes. I mean, local authorities rely heavily already on their local voluntary sector partnerships, and that's an important part of, I think, the lessons that we've learned from this is just how important those are when you come to a whole system emergency of this kind of sort in the future.
Mr Norris, I won't take you to all of the lessons learned, they're there in your statement, but I will move on now to Ms Allen. You set out 6 bullet points at the end of your statement at paragraph 66. I'm just going to summarise those, which do seem quite specific to the impacts that we've been exploring in evidence today. Firstly, investment in IT and digital capability. And is that because of the impact of digital exclusion that we've heard about, as well as the need for IT to keep communities going during a pandemic? Is that why you highlight that?
Yes, but also the need to invest in the infrastructure within the public sector generally. The issue of digital exclusion is only one part of that. People need the services to be available in those formats as well. So that it covers both aspects of that.
And then you identify the need to review particularly how councils are able to facilitate access to services without physical attendance. I think, is that part of the same point?
Yes, absolutely. And it speaks to a point made by Nicola earlier on around some of the arrangements that were made to enable people to access services during the pandemic have continued. So Nicola gave the example around registration of births, deaths and marriages. So those impacts those are big life events, some of them very difficult for people, but that practice has continued, so we need to invest more in that.
And then you deal with a couple of points concerning the need to evaluate the capabilities of partner service providers. So again, is that built on the experience of voluntary and community organisations needing to be deployed during the pandemic or civil emergencies?
Yeah, I think if we're honest with ourselves, the voluntary community sector were out of the starting blocks before the public sector was. I think we have all said that in previous modules. But I think it speaks to the point that you can't always assume that sector will be present to be able to respond in the way that you may need it to a future emergency if you don't continue investment. It would be remiss of me not to be to say that sector is constantly facing difficulties, financial difficulties in terms of their core presence. So that's the essence of that point.
And finally, I don't need to ask you to expand. You have suggested exploring a mutual aid protocol between civil servants and local government, and the importance of data sharing between council, government departments and arm-length bodies, which is part of the evidence that's relevant to the issue of identifying the vulnerable and shielding, as I understand it.
Yes, so the fragmented nature of public services in Northern Ireland, which is different to the rest of GB, means that services are provided by a range of arm's-length bodies as well as central government departments and local government. Data sharing to enable us to properly support those in most need was one of the most challenging parts of the early part of the pandemic.
Thank you so much. Ms Dickey, your lessons learned are at section 8 of your statement. There are 14 of them, so again, I won't go through all of them, and I won't deal with matters already addressed in earlier modules or repeat points that have just been made. Specific measures that you identify at paragraphs 8.9 to 8.14 that prove particularly effective include councils themselves rapidly adapting to digital service delivery and things such as online council meetings?
Yeah, so that was something that local government in Scotland had started to tentatively explore before the pandemic, and that was ramped up really quickly in individual councils, and COSLA ourselves continued to host all of our governance meetings so that we had the right records and the right lessons learned there. So yeah, I think that was something that was useful and something that we've carried forward. It also increases the visibility to the general public, in that a lot of these meetings are publicly streamed. So you perhaps couldn't get everyone into the local council hall, but you can absolutely send people the link and let them feel part of their local democracy. So I think that was successful across the piece.
And the remainder of your points are on the theme of coordination of support with third sector organisations, co-production of approaches with communities themselves. And I think we've already covered that, but that's an important part of the lessons to be learned.
Absolutely. I mean, I know you've heard first from Sir Michael Marmot and others in terms of inequality. I suppose from a COSLA perspective, our first principle would be let's tackle the inequality. But in the meantime, and until we do, every single policymaker and decision maker across civic society needs to understand the impact of inequalities that people are up against. An awful lot of similarities across a number of groups have very similar characteristics around about digital exclusion, etc., etc. So our policymakers until we can tackle the inequality, we need to recognise the impact of inequality on outcomes.
Thank you so much. Finally, Dr. Llewellyn, your list runs from paragraphs 191 to 216, pulling out two, I think, new points not covered by the other witnesses. First, quite a specific one, and returning to the theme that we covered first, that's sport, leisure and cultural activities. You note and have noted how important these services are to communities and how they can be undervalued, and you say that's a mistake. One of the suggestions you make is designing organised non-contact physical and recreational sport as part of planning. That was one of the suggestions that you made, I think.
Yeah, again, it's allowing for local flexibility to interpret local circumstances while staying within the national guidelines. I think Mark mentioned having to widen a footpath in some leisure facilities. It's that kind of thing, so that we have the national strategic approach, but then we allow for local interpretation according to whatever the circumstances are.
But on this particular issue of being in a position to offer non-contact physical activity, and I think Ms Dickey was also highlighting that should be accessible to people, boys and girls, men and women.
Yeah, and it's taking account of all of those factors when planning and when developing provision.
And on housing, again, quite a specific point, and it arises from the evidence that you explained to us earlier about the impact of the earlier release of prisoners. You've suggested that work be done about support plans for rehousing in the event of something similar occurring.
Yeah, again, I think as it transpired, I think in 2020, eventually the potential difficulties were resolved. But as with much of what we've discussed today, prior planning, early engagement with local authorities, data sharing as well, sharing planning assumptions in terms of data, all of that, the sooner that those discussions take place, then the more effective the provision will be.
And finally, for funeral arrangements, you've emphasised the importance of learnings from this pandemic, and you've covered the difficulty with restrictions on attendance. Again, in your lessons learned, you touch on the need for understanding of different cultural and faith needs within the community, and I think you've already covered that. So unless you have anything to add to it.
Yeah, no, nothing to add.
So those are a selection of the lessons learned, my lady. Can I just turn to any of the witnesses if they feel that there's anything in particular they'd like to cover at this point? I'm not seeing anybody. So, my lady, unless you have any further questions yourself, those are my questions, and there are some from call participants.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Rahman. I think Ms Iqbal, you're up again.
Thank you, my lady. Dr Llewellyn, I'm asking you a question on behalf of the Migrants' Rights Consortium. In your witness statement, sort of beginning around page 31, you set out some of the challenges of implementing homelessness schemes during the pandemic, such as the Everyone In scheme. However, you do not mention if there were difficulties reconciling immigration policy with this scheme. The Migrants' Rights Consortium have provided evidence in their witness statement that the Everyone In scheme created confusion for local authorities, as the government never explicitly stated whether undocumented migrants must be accommodated under the scheme, or the legal basis for doing so, which led to legal challenges. So my question to you is, what was the impact of this lack of clarity on the Welsh Government's response to implementing the scheme?
There was some discussion between local authorities and the Welsh Government, and there was an awareness of the issue you've mentioned. And I think where we eventually got to was a wider interpretation of existing powers. I think we refer to it in our evidence in terms of addressing homelessness, but also in some of the school hubs and free school meal provision, so that those groups without access to public funding, that provision was expanded as far as possible within the powers that were allowed to incorporate their needs.
Thank you. I'm grateful, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Iqbal. And Ms Beattie, I think you're the last person to ask questions today.
Thank you, my lady. I ask questions on behalf of national disabled people's organisations. And if I can take you back to community level sports and leisure and ask about the impact on access by disabled people. Did disabled people suffer a disproportionate impact of the closure of sports and leisure services and facilities, including interruption to specialised, adapted, bespoke and inclusive services and accessible facilities, which reduced opportunities for exercise and community engagement?
So, sorry, is that for me?
I'm asking it to all the entire panel, but Dr. Llewellyn,
Yeah,
you'd
no,
like to
if I can
start.
come in first, then yes, I think your assessment is correct. I think that is the case. There were other groups as well where access was diminished, but I think there probably was a disproportionate impact.
And I don't know if either or any of the other panel members.
I completely agree. I think you're completely correct. Absolutely.
And I agree with Chris's statement there, is that yes, I think there was, but also there was also a significant impact on other groups as well.
And just in terms of what that impact entailed, did those closures and interruptions pose particular problems for disabled people of things like physical immobility, physical decline and associated loss of independence and ability to live independently, which again might be distinct from impacts on other groups?
I think that is the case, and I suspect they were wider in terms of emotional well-being and mental health as well. I think there were probably wider consequences.
So that's part of a significant loss beyond the immediate physical activity that you referred to before. My lady, may I just check that Ms Dickey wanted to add anything as a
Sure, she does,
courtesy?
but you may.
I'm grateful. Ms Dickey, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I would agree with colleagues, and I suppose earlier in my evidence I gave a practical example of how those living with a disability would be further impacted by closure of swimming pools specifically.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Beattie. That completes our questions for you for today. Some of you, I think, have been with me since the first module. Our connection goes back a long way. Thank you so much for all the help you provided over the last how many years. And I'm extremely grateful to the local authority associations across the UK for the support they've given the inquiry. It's been extremely valuable. And I know that you know Ms Stovey's been very helpful in representing various associations. So thank you for all your help. The other thing I'm glad about is that we've been able to shine a bit of a light on the role that local authorities across the UK played during the pandemic and the dedication and hard work of all their staff. So thank you very much indeed for your help, and please convey my gratitude to all your colleagues too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very well, Ms Rahman, I think that concludes today's proceedings, and I shall return 10 o'clock tomorrow.
My lady, thank you.
Thank you.